My name is Cera. I'm the CEO of Arcweb. Welcome. I'm actually one of the early co-founders of Philly Startup Leaders. One of probably 5 people that gets credit for helping to start the organization, and glad to be here, and glad that all of you are here, and glad to see that PSL is still carrying on and helping to focus on peer mentorship and helping to bring people up. And essentially convert people to entrepreneurship. PSL is essentially how I learned everything that I know about business. I never went to business school. My background's in engineering, so I'd say most of what I've learned about business, I've learned from the Philly community, and Philly Startup Leaders has been a huge part of that. So I'm really excited about the accelerator overall. I'm happy to help participate, and I'm glad you all are here. Hopefully, I can help you to manage your product development design efforts a little bit better with some education on some basics and then some core concepts that I think are helpful. So we'll get started. So building products, building software, it's all about people, and you need really the right people in different areas to build a product successfully. And so some of these are obvious, but I want to just describe the roles just in case folks don't know. So user interface, user experience designer, that is a person that essentially takes a product or takes a problem and designs a solution that will involve hardware, it'll involve software, it can involve can involve anything. Ultimately, design is how something works. It's not necessarily how something looks or how its aesthetics. I mean, ultimately, it's how something works, and all of the interactions and everything that are involved. And in my experience, I have around 30 people that work here at Arcweb, designers, engineers, and whatnot. It's actually harder to find a talented designer than it is to find a talented engineer. And if you ask people around town, people are always, I need an engineer, I need my technical co-founder. Try finding a really good designer. Good luck. So it's even more of a rare skill set, and I almost think the market almost doesn't recognize that entirely, and a lot of businesses still don't necessarily appreciate it. Engineers, that's easy. Those are the people that are the software developers that are basically making a software product, coding the languages and making it work. Business systems analyst, now this is like a subtle, or it's a role that isn't obvious to a lot of people, but basically it's someone that understands the business and is trying to design a solution and also understand the problem of that particular product or that business. So usually these are called BAs or BSAs, and on a product team, if you're familiar with what a user story is, and I'm going to get into some of that, a business system analyst, a good portion of their day is spent basically writing user stories, talking to customers, and trying to figure out essentially what problem is this product supposed to solve. In a startup, I would say the BA role is often held by one of the founders and sometimes the CEO or one of the other co-founders. Next is a project manager. That's basically the main communication point between the business side of the project as well as the engineering side. So that person basically is tangling between business and technical worlds and trying to get all sides to communicate effectively with one another. A product manager or product owner, depends sort of what book you're reading and what language you're speaking to some extent, but the product manager is, I would say, has all of the capabilities of a project manager. It's very common that a product manager was previously a project manager, but ultimately they're also in sort of a BA or BSA role. They're talking to the customers. They really understand the problem that the customer is having and the solution. And a lot of times product managers or product owners are the ones that own the budget. So ultimately they're the ones that can decide, do I hire a consulting firm to build this app? Do I hire in people internally? How am I going to meet my deadline with either of these two options? So in a startup, I'd say the critical founder roles, in my opinion, And everyone always thinks that it's the engineers, and I'm still an engineer. I don't think you can be an ex-engineer, but I have 2 engineering degrees, and I've built a lot of engineering systems, so I can say this without offending myself too much. But the roles that most founders, I would say, really suck at are project management and product management. And a lot of times, you'll find startups that have burned through like 3 CTOs, and a lot of times that's really not necessarily the fault of the technical people. A lot of times it's the fault of the business people and essentially the interfaces to the technical team. And so what I'm hoping a lot of you get out of this presentation is that you're all a little bit better with project management and product management. So ultimately, a business, there's 3 parameters in software, and that's basically time, money, and the scope of the product. I've heard this referred to as the iron triangle. I don't have a graphic of a triangle, but you can imagine different corners of the triangle being those 3 things. And in every project, if the time gets expanded or the budget gets expanded, you could imagine that as just being like a dent in one of the corners. And so the other areas of the triangle are always impacted depending upon which one of those moves. So basically, they're all very interdependent. So the role of a project manager and a product manager is to really manage these 3 things in a cohesive way. Budget being the most important to some extent in terms of how much is it going to actually spend to build this product. So part of the assignment is going to be to come up with a budget, and I'm going to go through how you can basically come up with a strategy for budgeting. Time is the next element, also basically being related to budget in some ways, because you can imagine you can get a cheaper software engineering team that's going to move slower, or a faster team that's going to be more expensive. And that's kind of where these things all interchange. Timeline is also important when being a project manager, because you not only have to manage how many days it's going to take of effort to build something, but also just the calendar itself. So the calendar is, shopping season's going to be ramping up for the holidays coming up. Most people don't work nights and weekends, so you have limited time, plus people are on vacation. So the project manager kind of has to figure out, well, I have this many engineering days, I have this many calendar days, these people might take vacation and whatnot, and really has to manage essentially the delivery of it all regardless. The last is scope. And scope is, I would say, oftentimes what we have the most control over. And so I'm going to spend a bit of time trying to focus on strategies for reducing scope in the name of essentially creating MVPs. And we're a consulting firm, so we get asked all the time to build things. And it's very often the case that working with a CEO, we're designing essentially this little tower hut over here, and within a month it turns into this massive structure that's leaning in the wrong direction, because we've been asked to bolt on 100 things in the 11th hour, 59th minute, and there's minimal planning. And as the engineering side of this, there's a lot of things that we can do to manage that, but at the same time, our incentive is also to minimize cost. So how you essentially fake your way into sales is not only a science, but it's also an art form. And a lot of what we preach here at Arcweb is essentially how to help our founders sell vaporware, and ultimately to sell the same product, but building less product. And so scope is by far the thing that we have the most control over. So one of the reading assignments was on user story specification. That was something that's I'd say a decent overview. There's a lot of different books that talk about ways to design a user story. And in simplest terms, it comes down to a tuple of a subject, verb, and an object. And the subject is always a role in the system or a role on the team. And so, for example, a user story here is database developer may add users via SQL. So let's imagine we have some kind of CRM software company, and we just sold our next customer, and they have 25 employees. So who's going to basically add these new employees to this customer? Well, according to this user story, a database developer is going to do it, not the actual customer. And what that saves you is by having a database developer do it, we have to build less of a product up front because now we're relying on the development team to be there when we add a customer, as opposed to allowing the customer with a full-blown user interface to add their own users, which is a lot of work in a lot of cases. User management is oftentimes taken for granted, and it can actually be a fairly complicated thing. So another reason why we write it out this way is so then we're totally transparent about the scope of the system, and so the CEO 5 months later in a dark room with scary blinds, I love this photo of Larry Ellison, why can't the customer add users? Hopefully that comes out earlier, and you're having that conversation with the person to say, look, we can save some money, budget and timeline overall, if we defer that feature to later. Let's make sure that a customer is willing to buy it or even cares whether or not they can add customers. And one of the case studies that was one of your assignments too is the PeopleLinks case study. Also talked about that. And that case study is actually, I didn't even realize it when this slide actually comes from an old version of our sales presentation from a couple years ago. But we did a case study with PeopleLinks where we basically showed doing this prototyping exercise saved them around 80% of a scoped budget. And so I'll explain what we did. Ultimately, they believe that user management should be a feature that their customers could do. So when they sold their product, the customer would then go in and add their 25 employees. And so we basically, first they asked us to build this, and we gave them an estimate. It was somewhere in around the $70,000 or $80,000 range. The exact numbers in the case study. And we basically challenged them to say, well, you've had a database developer adding your users the entire time. It hasn't really stopped you from getting customers. Why don't we prototype this and see if your salesperson can actually sell a customer on this feature, and then help get essentially that customer to help fund this individual feature. And if we can't get someone to fund it, then we're just not going to build it, and we're going to focus our time and energy on something else, presumably something else that the customer will buy if we build it. So long story short, we prototyped the feature using a prototyping tool, which in your assignment, we went through, in the reading exercise, I asked you to look at Balsamiq and a couple others. But basically, we used Axure, which is more of a pixel-perfect prototype. So the customers didn't realize that the demo itself was not the product. It was essentially a completely vapor version of their product. Walked them through exactly how the user admin feature worked, tried to upsell them and get them to buy, and they circled it to multiple customers, and basically no one cared. So what did we do? We didn't build it, and we saved them around 80% of their budget. And that is what I would say is, lean and meets sort of it. Well, so in a B2B product, you have the opportunity, and I know some of you are not all working on B2B products, but you really have an opportunity to sit down with a customer and walk them through a sales process and literally close the deal. In B2C products, you don't really have that luxury because, the difference is like someone clicks a buy now button or they click a contact us button. Like how many of you have gone to a product that you just wanted to buy or free trial and it says contact us and you're like, because you don't want to do it. Yeah, right. I don't want to talk to a salesperson most of the time if it's like, especially when I'm doing, I'd say procurement work like that, it's usually pretty late at night and, it's not during business hours anyway. So, but in a B2B business, that's essentially mostly how a lot of B2B software is sold. It's sold in a consultative solution sale environment. So you have an opportunity where you can use prototyping in a way that you really can't anywhere else. And so when I think of like taking the lean startup sort of to another level, especially for B2B businesses, it's all about how do you sell vaporware using prototypes. And so what we do for a lot of our customers is help them sell vaporware through prototypes. And ultimately trying to de-risk your business and get to customer validation without building anything. And so that's a topic I'll talk a little bit more about in a bit. Any questions so far? Stop. Yeah.
So vaporware means an idea of a product that is not yet built. Is that correct?
Correct. So it could be anything, right? So imagine a rock star salesperson doesn't need any product, doesn't need anything. Like they're just amazing. They throw their wizardry around and close a 7-digit deal without anything. Most people aren't like that. The next level is like, can you close a deal with a PowerPoint? A lot of technical people won't be sold with a PowerPoint. So the next level would be wireframes or, let's say a prototype that doesn't look pixel perfect. So you're honest with the prospective customer and saying, we're designing this and this is under development, but we haven't built it yet. What we did with PeopleLinks was an actual prototype. That's a pixel perfect prototype that actually feels like a real product. So in that case, it really was sort of truly vaporware in that it looked real, it seemed real. There's no database backend or anything connected to it. But to answer your question, I don't think you even need to go as far as a prototype, right? Like it all depends on the prospective customer that you're trying to sell. And a lot of that comes down to essentially your ability to sell that person and how comfortable you are being transparent with where you are in your company. And in the Lean Startup book, Eric Ries calls them visionary customers. And I've been trying to think of a better phrase. We'll stick with visionary customers for now. But I do think there's something to be said for being totally transparent about the state of your business. And usually you can do that with your colleagues that know you or people that have done business with you before. It's really hard to do that in some cases. And you also don't want to go after Walmart with your first sale. One of our customers just went to a very large customer literally with their first demo. And I kind of wish I would have caught them before they did it, just because there's no reason to go to your biggest customer with your first demo. Like there's plenty of people to sort of burn earlier. But a lot of that really only applies to B2B, because in B2C products, you literally need to build the product in order to have the experience that you need to truly do the type of testing that you want to be able to do. So it all depends on what you're doing. Any other questions? No? All right. So we're a consulting firm, so our process is what I would say is sort of a solution sales business process. But I would say most B2B products follow something similar to this, especially the more enterprisey or the more complicated, the more it follows some model of this. So we have our sales process, and that's a whole workflow diagram I'm not going to go into. Deal gets closed. Now we've kicked off. Then we're in a discovery process, and the deal that's been closed, if it's really complicated, usually it's sort of a two-stage deal. The first part of it is we're going to really figure out what is here, what we're building, how much it's going to take to kind of fit these solutions together. And then phase 2 is actually solving it. And usually that involves, for us, what we try to do is we try to take a swag at the whole thing. So if it's, a mobile app for an insurance company, we'll try to say, yeah, we think this is $500,000 or whatever. But we're going to go through a discovery process, and we'll basically build the specs at that point in time, and then we'll tell you what the number's going to be. So that way we're kind of soft circling with them $500K, telling them that it's not going to cost that much just yet. They're only committing to essentially what the discovery is. Usually for us, and it largely depends, but usually what I will quote is $30K for a discovery process as a fixed rate. And usually our implementations are all time and materials, meaning they basically pay us hourly. Some of that is services, business, consulting business, mumbo jumbo, but I would say anyone that's doing enterprise sales should be familiar with this. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about it, but be glad to go over more of this in depth, like one-on-one or whatever. So then we get to implementation. That's when we're actually building it, and then product gets delivered. Now, we do a similar process as consultants for even a basic mobile app. So we'll take a swag at something. Let's say it's $150,000. We'll do the fixed cost in discovery. Then in discovery, we're literally building all the specs for everything. And then at the end of it, hopefully we confirm, yes, this is $150,000. Our original swag was right. But sometimes we have to adjust the budget and whatnot. So anyway, that's sales ultimately to delivery. Most products have some notion of this, more so on the B2B side. What a discovery process looks like is essentially, this is kind of where the whole mapping the product piece comes into it, and I'm going to get into some more details exactly, but I'm putting up here how we do it as like an outside firm, because I think it's really important to see how an outside firm approaches these problems, because you ultimately internally are going to be doing essentially the same thing. And a lot of these processes are put into place because as an outside firm, we know even less than an internal person. But a lot of times an internal person knows just as little as we do as an external party coming in. So these processes basically work very well. I mean, we're basically able to jump from one business to the next, from one product to the next, and building things that we've never built before. And most of products, I would say the closest analogy I can give to software products is we're trying to win like Indy 500 races, and we're customizing products that are going to win those specific races. And you can't take some Subaru off the shelf and it's not going to win the Indy 500. You're going to have to keep into consideration what the track looks like, what the course is like, what the terrain is like, and you're going to build out a custom car that's going to win the race. And ultimately for us, what we're doing is we're trying to win against all the competitors in that same space. So we're trying to build the best custom car that we absolutely can that's going to get that business to the next step. And it's not just what the product does, it's also the funding strategy for the product as we're rolling out the business. So it's how much do we put into this minimally to figure out there's actually a there or a business there, so then we can throw down with a real investment and then take over the market. So that's sort of, I guess, at a macro level, what the thinking is behind it. So at a high level, what we're doing, we kick off a project and we do what we call a discovery meeting. Forget what happens in a discovery meeting. We're discovering stuff. We're asking lots of questions, we're showing designs, we're doing paper prototyping, with lots of whiteboards with the customer and trying to work through problems. At the end of that, we have a bunch of things that we publish. So we publish designs based on the feedback. We also publish user stories. So that user story I gave you before, we have a whole list of those that we're producing after every single one of these meetings. And then eventually, this process repeats. We can usually do 2 of these a week. In a super aggressive product, we'll do 3 a week. And that's really like whipping the designers to move fast, because usually they can't create enough content to be productive 3 meetings a week. Usually only takes, 2 is sort of they're maxed out. So this whole process is like a 4 to 6 week process for most products, and I'd say that's most product MVPs in like the $150,000 range. This repeats for some number of weeks. Then eventually, we have an agreement with the business that the designs get approved, the stories are approved, and essentially we know exactly what we're building, the business agrees, we agree, everyone's happy, and we're ready to move forward to the next step. Then we do what we call a waterfall estimate. And anyone in software knows waterfall process versus agile process. We deliberately call this a waterfall estimate because that's exactly what it is. We're basically taking the best swag that we possibly can with the information that we have, not knowing exactly how a customer is going to react once it's built, not knowing exactly how all the things that can come up in the product lifecycle. So it's called a waterfall estimate for a reason. So we publish that. If our original swag was correct, then usually that's approved very quickly. Sometimes we basically say, there is no way that we can build this social, mobile, local component to this. You need another $50,000, and that's it. Then we jump to the implementation. So only once we have complete agreement and alignment where we are do we move forward. And I would say this can be sliced up. It really depends, and it depends a lot on the sales process and who we're dealing with. So large Fortune 500s have a lot of lawyers and a lot of procurement people, and usually they want a lid on everything that's happening. They want, basically a warranty in case anything goes wrong. They don't want to give up anything, and they don't want any risk. So we're willing to run, I'd say, a really aggressive, agile process here if we know that the attorneys and everybody is going to play ball. But if at the end of the day, they ultimately are trying to fix our scope and fix our deliverables and fix everything all up front, which there's 20 years of books that tell you that this does not work. If they're trying to do that, then fine. We're going to basically waterfall the whole thing because or I shouldn't say the whole thing. We will waterfall as much as we need to make them happy. And that's just business. And I think in some ways we hire a lot of engineers and we try, I think our best to provide an environment that's very agile and that is doing all the best practices that the industry says that we should do. But the mere nature of being consultants and being an external party, usually people are like, I have $150,000 to build this thing and I don't have any more. I don't have any rich uncles I can ask for any more money. That's it. So immediately the budget's fixed. So in some ways that implies somewhat of a fixed amount of scope. So managing that whole process can be very, very, you just have to do it very carefully. We've done it a lot and we learn something new I think every time that we do it. But anyway, the only reason why I go into a lot about the waterfall estimates and how much you can slice up this process is really it depends on who the buyer is. Like usually the end user is gung-ho and wants us there and everything else. And then it's like, woohoo, we're going to do this deal, let's go. And then we try to get the paperwork done and all the lawyers come in and they're like, we don't care about those people. Yeah, I know they said that they need you and yeah, they're really nice, but we don't care about them. Like, we need you to do this, 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 and this. So you literally almost have to resell the whole deal all over again. And any of you doing B2B products, it's exactly the same. You have to identify your end user, close the deal with them. Then you have to identify the money person, close the deal with them. And then oftentimes you have to identify or at least scoot around the IT people and close them. And that's like B2B software sales in a nutshell. You need to identify all three buyers. And I'd say usually in cases where we're dealing with startups, a lot of times that team is really small. In larger companies, I'd say if we have 2 out of 3 of those people, we can usually close a deal. We have only 1, we have very, very low chances of closing a deal. So we're very good early in our sales process to identify all 3 of those. And so if you're, again, in a B2B product, this is like really important. And we can talk more about sales. I ultimately spend most of my time doing sales and business development now. So if anyone wants to talk about that offline, we can do it. All right. So I'm going to go into details of the discovery. Any questions up to this point? Yeah.
Another term. What does waterfalling mean?
So waterfall essentially is the traditional way that software has always been done, where you design everything up front, then you go into implementation, then you go into testing, and then you deliver it, and hope that all of those things go perfectly well. But usually there's some number of iterations of that have to occur. But usually people up front are designing for one iteration when they should really be designing for multiple. Is that helpful?
So the waterfall has multiple iterations? Okay.
All depends on the buyer. Usually they're trying to push you to one big bang release. It all depends how you sell these things, which we get better and better every day about how we sell these products into large companies. But sometimes you're dealing with people that don't understand software. They're used to walking into Rite Aid, picking something off the shelf and going to the cash register and buying it. Well, software does not work that way at all. Every software product that I've ever worked on has like a trove of hundreds of defects that are in the don't fix category because they're not worth fixing. And that's just the nature of software. Any other questions? Cool. All right, so discovery process. So the whole goal is to really ultimately figure out what are we building. A lot of times people are like, tell me what this is going to cost to build my mobile app. And it's like, well, I need to spend a month with you to figure out what I'm even building. So like, there's no way I can quote you or anyone. And there's plenty of firms around town and nationally that will quote people with like no information. And the strategy there is that they underbid projects and in the hopes of getting the business and then deal with it when it goes over budget. So I would say that's not a very good strategy, in my opinion. So we try to push for basically doing a discovery. That way, I feel like we're on the same playing field. We're all working on the same side of the table ultimately with the customer. We're almost like employees at that point. Like, we get added to the project, we are paid, essentially the day that we start, just like you would a normal employee. And so that's how we structure our deals. So part of the discovery process is to provide continuous delivery and feedback to the customer. And the way that we do that, we basically have business meetings, which are bi-weekly, where we are meeting with the customer to make sure they're happy with how everything is going. That's totally separate. That's more of a client relations thing, but it's like, are you happy? How are we doing? Are we meeting our budget? Are we meeting our deliverables? Okay, great. That happens once every 2 weeks. Then we have discovery meetings. Those are those 2 to 3 weeks, 2 to 3 time a week meetings. And the output of the discovery process, the deliverables essentially can really vary. So you can have what I'd say are a minimal set of deliverables, or you can have a pretty exhaustive set of deliverables. And there's pros and cons to each. So a lot of times you can get by with just a minimal set of deliverables and still be successful hitting your budget and timeline. In some cases, it's kind of counterintuitive. I mean, in some ways, you can spend all day long de-risking and speccing out your business, and in some days, it's just like, all right, let's just move on and let's just do this thing, right? So it kind of involves a game day call to say, I'm ready to move forward. This is good enough. And so for us as outside consultants, it really depends on the customer that we're working with. We try to push for a minimal set of deliverables. I mean, at almost every turn as a firm, we're trying to minimize the amount of time that we spend on almost anything to get to as much validation as we possibly can. And some of that involves risk for us, so it's kind of accepting a certain amount of risk for us as an outside firm, and then all of it is risk for the customer and trying to minimize their risk as well. And by minimizing our risk, we actually increase the risk of our customers. So it's like, well, I can spend all day speccing this thing out, but now I'm increasing their budget. So it's like, well, at what point am I just going to belly up and say, like, this is good enough, let's go? So a lot of this comes down to really, really smart decisions in all aspects on design, from business analysts and from engineers. So we have, basically our team leaders of all 3 teams basically giving the final go on the bulk of our projects for what they do, just to make sure all checks and balances are in place in all of the right places, just because a lot of times it is a game day call. And again, it's like you're trying to win a race and that's never been raced before with parts that have never been used before. I mean, everything's custom. Like, the reason why you see so many startups burn through like 3 CTOs, and then when the 4th one comes in, he's like, I have to rewrite everything. And it's because basically you're in the custom car business. They built custom engine, custom transmission, custom everything. There's no documentation, and there's no way in hell you can figure out how this thing works. And that's also bad engineering practice, means that there's no standards, no documentation, anything else, which is why you have to pick a really good firm. That way they can at least build a custom car that has a lot of standards to it, so you can win the race and you can transition your team at the end of the day. So, minimal deliverables. User stories get created, they're categorized, and they're estimated. I'll give some examples of this. User interface and UX prototypes, I'll give some examples of these. Waterfall estimates for budget and timeline, that's part of your assignment, and I'll go through some examples. Oftentimes this includes a system architecture, and I only put that in there because that one can be really, really important to reduce risk in some projects. Here's a more exploded list of deliverables if you were going to do like a full-blown discovery. And this is really ultimately building a spec, for a software product that you could literally shop to multiple firms, get bids. You could run an RFP process, which is called a request for proposal process. Once you have this spec built, the idea is that multiple people can come along and basically understand the business, the product, and bid on it. So I tried to give some notion of which person on the team would work on these deliverables. In a lot of these, it's kind of a team effort, but I'll go through each one of these. The reason why I put system architecture is because system architecture can be really, really important for specific products. And if you can imagine like the difference between a native mobile app and a mobile web app, there's a lot of things that are pretty crippled in mobile web apps that aren't in native apps. But it all depends what you need to do. Like, is it interacting with the photo library? Is it interacting with the GPS? Things of that nature, which are really, really do well with native mobile apps, but don't do well with just a typical web application. So that requires some chops in architecture to know the user experience is going to be impacted. Therefore, this business might be less viable. Therefore, the customers might devalue the overall value proposition, et cetera. And that can be an epic level failure. If you misfire on that and you build a mobile web app when you should have built a native app, you've now burned $150,000 and someone wants to blow your head off. I mean, that's ultimately, what the scenario is. And then it's like, all right, well, and then for me as an owner of a consulting firm, all right, well, I just paid 75% of that to my employees to build this thing, and now I have a customer that's literally asking for all of their money back. It's never happened, but these are the things that keep me up at night, because they've never, and for that reason, they've never happened. But that can be a pretty scary situation. And if you were an employee at a company, you basically would just get fired, I think, for making sort of epic level failure like that. But a lot of times people think that they can just design a product completely in a vacuum without engineers or any people on the architecture side, and that's not true. You need to have someone there on the architecture side to really maintain feasibility for some of the high-risk components. And I'm going to go through some of the high-risk components side of this. All right, so this is for building a spec and ultimately an extended deliverable. Now, for your assignment, you don't have to do this. I was very clear in what has to be done on the assignment. But basically, listing all the devices, OS versions, and web browsers. I cannot tell you how many bugs we get for some of the apps we're building that are this iPhone with this iOS version and not, and other things. So literally, every one of these things is just scope, meaning more engineering time, meaning more money. Web browsers, browser versions. Do you have to support as far back as IE6? Can you safely tell your customers, too bad, we're only going to support the last two versions of every major modern web browser, and those include IE, Safari, whatever. Because a lot of times what happens is our customer will say to us, oh yeah, who cares about IE6? And then we deploy it, everything's good, and then one day I get the CEO phone call, and it's like, what the hell's going on? The guys, we just closed this deal and it's not working. And it's IE6. And I'm like, oh man, I'm so glad we documented this. We never spec'd out we're doing IE6. It's probably going to cost you another 50 grand if you want to do IE6. No one does IE6 anymore. Tell your customer to go away. So anyway, these are the things. Like when I hear startups that have burned through 3 CTOs, it's because they never had a discussion about really what the overall requirements were, and then they go into bug fixing hell for months and never ship anything because some of this basic stuff was never really discussed and put on the table up front. Listing all your assumptions. I didn't go into this into detail because I feel like this could be almost subject of a whole nother talk entirely, but I think with every estimate should include a list of assumptions that aren't necessarily covered here. So beyond devices and browser versions and things like that, trying to think of an example. I'll come back to it. Vendors and integrations. So this is also something I say frequently overlooked. Vendor selection is actually really important. Whoever sends your push notifications, whoever sends your emails, whoever sends your SMS messages, so Twilio, SendGrid, whoever you're doing your PayPal or your payment processing, whether it's PayPal or Stripe, all of these vendors are not only technical integrations, they're also business integrations. So there's business agreements that you need to sign, there's people that need to approve these things, there's money that needs to be exchanged, there's partnership agreements, and all this stuff that literally is oftentimes looked at as an engineering problem. And sometimes I'll hear of someone here being asked to go chase down someone on the phone to basically get their vendor agreement signed, and we'll frequently stop them and say that's really not in our scope. We're supposed to get handed API keys. They have to work out the business deal. I mean, we can advise them certainly, who's good to work with, who's not, and that sort of thing. But it's not really. It's usually good if you're trying to negotiate with DocuSign to get instead of paying X dollars per signature to pay less. You're going to negotiate that deal much better than we are on your behalf. So role matrix, another huge one. So how many people? What are the roles of the system that have to be supported? So there's an admin capability of almost every product. You as CEO, founder, need a certain amount of information from the system. How many customers do I have? How many bought stuff yesterday? How many went to the site yesterday? all of those things are admin functionality. That's not what your end users are going to see. So end users could be another role you might have. We had one product where we had people that were specific to the delivery people. So we had delivery people, then we had salespeople. And so all of these roles are, huge pieces of scope because every one of them will have different experiences, different dashboards, different functionality, different everything. Next is user stories, which we already covered. On the architecture side and engineering side, identifying high-risk components is huge. So we had a project, fortunately it was an internal project that had, I would say, a very scientific component to it. And it involved actually, we were building this fun SEPTA app, which we still never shipped because we haven't, we were only working on it when we were benched and then we decided not to work on it anymore. But basically we were trying to figure out exactly where the buses are at any given time. And if you have messed around with the SEPTA API at all, you know that you only get buses and their times. There's no sort of interpolation between any 2 points. And so we were trying to figure that out. It's basically a science project to some extent. Now, someone at university, whether it be Drexel or Penn, computer scientists, would love to work on that for an entire term and produce an excellent paper on it. That's not really great, I would say, for most businesses to endeavor into science projects unless that's part of the core value proposition. If it is part of the core value proposition, then that needs to be identified up front, and it needs to be worked on, I would say, in a vacuum to make sure from a proof of concept perspective, you can actually achieve the scientific goal and validate basically what is truly a scientific hypothesis. So in this case, it's like to track a GPS coordinates of a bus at any given time. Was the query, and we were never able to really figure it out in the amount of time that we had estimated. So identifying those up front is key. System architecture, that kind of goes into the mobile web versus native thing. Waterfall estimate. You can do these waterfall estimates as you're building the product, but you can also do them sparingly, throughout the project. It's basically a health check, and it basically says, yes, I think I will be done this in 8 weeks. My estimate was 12. I'm under budget. Woohoo! I'm awesome. Yes.
Is that the grooming that you refer to? In some of the reading, you mentioned grooming a little.
So, no, that's part of implementation process, and that's specific to working with your customer on the user story itself to pick out the database developer adds the users or the customer adds the users. So grooming the story just means making that story more specific. It's like a lot of jargon, but that's the nomenclature. Any other questions? All right, cool. The designer, I would say, does a lot of things, and again, design is ultimately how something works, not necessarily how it looks. So really the most key piece of your product is how it's designed. So it's always going to include some research, some concepting, and usually an initial concepting meeting will be someone designing on a whiteboard or paper prototypes, literally right in front of the customer, hashing out really quick designs, because the designer could basically go in a room, sit down, make a bunch of stuff pretty, but the idea of having synchronized contact with the customer, with the designer, to create experiences that are going to work for the customer, work for their end user, as efficiently as possible is really important. So there's various design studio methods to kind of come up with that. So that's part of concepting. Then there's the user interface, user experience prototyping, which is part of our assignment. I'll go into some more. Wireframes, there's, I'd say, a few definitions of wireframes. When I think of wireframes, I just think of really the high-level hierarchy of the site or the application. So if you go into Gmail, you can check your mail. You can go into settings. Those are the key gating points for the product, and the wireframe should show that. And that's usually something that comes out in the concepting phase. Style kit. This is more important later, but ultimately that's what's the look and feel, what are the colors, what are the logo fonts and all that stuff that comes together. So if you create a good style kit, then whenever the engineers are building basically anything, they'll know exactly how to style things because your style kit will have all the CSS and everything else ready to rock. All right, any other questions? All right, cool. I do it on time. What time did we get started? What's that? All right. No, I think it was later than that. Nah, because my thing here says 40 minutes. I think, and about 40? All right, cool, thanks. All right, scope decomposition. So you have this big product that you want to build, and it's like, well, how do I begin trying to figure out, how do I create these user stories? How do I figure out what to design and concept next? And we were talking actually internally today about variations of this. This talk's been very helpful because I've actually been going through with my team about a lot of this stuff and just sort of rehashing things, some which we already know and then some which is kind of new. But basically what we came up with, or what we think is the most important way to decompose a product, is by the core customer pain point. So what is the core value proposition for your product? So if your product is a time tracker, that's the pain point, right? So focus on its time tracking capabilities first. And if it's a B2B product, then literally your prototype is literally just going to show the pain point and see if you can get a customer to walk across the finish line just demoing that pain point. A lot of really complicated IT products have, one pain point that's the major one and 20 that are must-have minor pain points, which are harder, but the decomposition that we would recommend is basically the same. So stick with the pain points. That way you're lining up with the customer value and focusing on those first as you decompose the product. So if the pain point is with the customer, so let's say it's a time tracking system, we use something here called Toggle for tracking all of our time, then don't worry about the admin capability, because that's really not the pain point at the end of the day. It's really the end user. So design all the end user flow first. And that's kind of the next decomposition, is that doing it by user. So let's say you've gone through all the pain points and now you've just got to sort of slog through the rest of the product. The next thing that we recommend is basically by user. So admin user, ops user, customer user, try to prioritize it by pain point still, but user would be next. Another way would be looking at existing solutions, or if you're rebuilding an existing product, or if there's a standard in the industry, a competitor, look at their solution and decompose theirs by what you think is the pain point and start there. And the idea of doing this decomposition is, hopefully you've got a few visionary customers that you can start, testing some of these on early, and not go through the whole process, start to finish, soup to nuts, and then start testing. But it all depends on your level of comfort and sort of the transparency that you're able to do with that customer. Last is by system. So some products have just a mobile app, some have a web app, and you can kind of decide just to do it by system. So I think the core message here is to do it by pain point, start there, and then sort of work your way to lesser interesting things. And didn't I thought I had another slide. Maybe I have it later. So next is implementation process, and I'm gonna run through this very quickly. Any questions on discovery at all? I'll go back to. Nope. All right. Cool. So the implementation process is basically how the engineers are creating the product. So at this point, the product's already been designed, you already have prototypes, and now the engineering team is literally just cranking it out. These get organized into sprints. This is just your typical agile software development process. These get organized into sprints, meaning 1 or 2 week iterations. And we're going to start here. And each of these loops is basically one of these iterations. And then eventually, your product basically is demonstrated and accepted. So that process repeats until eventually you're like, this is good enough, we're going to ship it to customers. So we begin a sprint. It starts by publishing all the user stories that you have. Then they need to be what's called groomed. And that's going through with the customer to make sure crystal clear alignment with the customer. So what they said and what you heard are exactly the same thing. So there's all kinds of science behind user story creation, and I think just going with basic subject, verb, object is a very simple tactic and can be very effective at a start. So We groom them with the customer. Then the engineering team estimates them, and we make sure, like, if the estimate for one engineer is 5 days for a week, we make sure that we're not expecting that they do 10 days worth of work in 5 days. So once the estimates are done, we make sure that that's all going to fit into a sprint. So we have a sprint planning meeting where all of this is basically approved, and we kick off the sprint. At that point, engineers are building stuff. We have what's called a daily Scrum meeting, and that basically is a daily checkpoint with the development team. You answer 3 questions. What are your goals for tomorrow? Recap your goals from yesterday, and what are you blocked on right now? Meaning like, oh, I couldn't get the API key from DocuSign because those guys still didn't sign the damn forms, or whatever it is. That's a blocker. So that should be discussed every day because that engineer can't get their work done. Engineers should not be interrupted 50 times a day. That is why project managers need to exist. And it's one of the things that I was saying earlier, most CEOs suck at project management. And one of the things, the worst things that they can do is interrupt their engineers 50 times a day with all these little things. So part of this daily Scrum is there's a 15-minute meeting, which is your key interface point to all the people on the engineering team. Now, if you have one technical co-founder and one person designing it, it might be hard to interface with that person only once a day. And I'd almost recommend not doing it once a day. But in a strict sense, like there's studies that say if you interrupt an engineer, they lose about 15 minutes worth of time. And that is totally true. And when I've designed systems, so much of that is literally in my head, and I'm like not on Earth at the moment. I'm in like virtual land designing this architecture, and then someone taps me on the shoulder, and it takes me 15 minutes to get back there. And so you want to minimize your interruptions, and that's like what you can do as a CEO is not interrupt the person that's coding stuff 50 times a day. So the point of that meeting primarily is the main interruption point. And if you go through those 3 things with your whole team, you can adjourn the meeting and then say, oh, I have a couple other things I want to talk to you about while you're already interrupted, and then go through those things. And then hopefully you can ignore that person for the remainder of the day. Because there's not too much that they're going to go in the wrong direction. Otherwise, hopefully you have enough trust and communication with them that they're going to come to you if they're sort of going down the wrong path. Anyway, that's the daily Scrum meeting. That happens every day. So in a sprint of 10 business days, that's going to happen 10 times in between your sprint planning meeting and then when you demonstrate the sprint. So basically, this is a sprint implemented. That means everything is done in it, or we're out of time. We demonstrate it. It's either rejected or it's accepted. Products demonstrated, products rejected. I'm just showing like all the gross steps here. Actually, there should be an arrow from accepted to sprint begins, but whatever. That's for the next sprint. I'll add that later. But if your sprint's accepted, then you need to jump into the next one. But basically, I'm just trying to show a workflow here of your sprints are not always accepted. Because let's say you weren't crystal clear on those user stories and your database developer or your customer is not able to add users yet, then that's going to get rejected and it's going to get put into the next sprint. Any questions about that? Kind of ripping through Agile Software Development 101 really fast. Mm-hmm.
How often is the scope expanded within the implementation process?
It happens all the time. So, I mean, scope is negotiated literally at every day, at every meeting. So it just takes a lot of discipline as sort of a founder and CEO to not add scope. And it's hard. And it all depends upon your sort of like ability to get customers regardless of an imperfect scenario. Any other questions? All right. So implementation process. So again, focused on continuous delivery and feedback. Priority is given to critical components with the highest risk. So we had a project where we were asked to do OCR with a camera. So literally just throw my camera right here and do OCR. There's a lot of applications that do it. This one specifically was supposed to read these types of mailing labels. It was basically a research project. A computer science department research lab would very much love this problem and to work on it for other students. We basically said, we'll spend 5 days on it, and we'll let you know on the 3rd day how far we've gotten. On the 3rd day, we actually had progressed in some areas really well, but I think overall from a business perspective, the solution that we had was not very good for doing the types of OCR that they needed to do, which was a mixture of barcode, QR code, and OCR all in one. And so there's just a bunch of different problems. So basically, we bailed. And the CEO was like, all right, fine, my customers don't need this. Even though initially he was like, they need it, they need it, they need it. But that was actually a really good moment for him because he really had to think hard, like, all right, I'm going to not give this to my customers even though I want to give it to them. But what he realized basically was that it was going to be really expensive to build this and really painful for him. So on one hand, yeah, you can go up to your engineering team and slap them a bunch of times and hope that you get what you want. But on the other hand, you're just sort of like contributing to the level of stress that they're going to have to work. So part of it is not burning out your engineering team. And most of the time in startups, the engineering teams are majorly burned out. So, and a lot of that I think is due to CEOs that ultimately suck at project management, which I will continue to harp on as the thesis. So business meetings, these still happen once every 2 weeks, focused on with the customer. Are you happy? How's the team delivering? Do you like the team? There's like 3 criteria that's really important. Do you like the team? Do they deliver? And are they playing as a team? Are they a team player? A lot of times people don't do well working with other engineers. And I don't know if it's just, engineering curriculums are really strict in terms of math and science, so you have really, really smart people that have huge egos all the time. So, there's a lot of engineering teams that don't mix. And if you're trying to do a project with not only your team that needs to play ball with an internal engineering team, you need people that are team players. Otherwise, game over. Sprint planning acceptance meetings, we recommend doing these once every 2 weeks. You can do them once a week. We found 2 weeks has gotten us better velocities. There's a research paper there. Take our word for it. Or try your own, test with your own team and see what works better. And then Scrum meetings five times a week. So I try to write down what all the interface points are. All right. I am over my time, and I'm still going to keep talking. Any objections? Yeah.
Can you concentrate a little bit more on the fire training and prototyping as well?
Yeah. So I have some examples that I am going to go over. So if you're patient, I'll jump into those, okay? All right, project management tools. There are a lot of tools out there to do project management, and I think a lot of CEOs or founders get really, really confused in tooling. Really, software project management can be done in a Google spreadsheet or in Excel. Like, there's nothing really that hard. And unless you have a 10-person distributed team, I would say Excel totally works. We use Pivotal Tracker here. I wouldn't necessarily advocate with an iron fist that they must use Excel, but I would say if a lot of times CEOs need to be project managers, and sometimes the tool can be the problem. For instance, Jira, I think, is the hardest tool for CEOs to use for whatever reason. No CEOs ever get it. So I would recommend not to use Jira because your CEO is not going to get it. They're not going to be able to track team velocity and understand what's going on. And that's not a good thing. Generally speaking, I'm talking about startups where the CEO is actually, a hardcore operator on the product. So to give you a very, very simple example of doing project management in Excel, and I literally did this for a while. So I know for a fact it works, and I've done, more than $1 million worth of service deals in Excel. So I can promise you that this totally works. I think you'll get some resistance from your engineering team, but I just want to sort of point out what the key drivers are and sort of what you need to focus on, and nothing else really matters. So we have priority of user stories. Each one of them is estimated. They're assigned to a person. The user story itself, maybe a note. Sometimes you can add a column in here, or if it probably makes sense in a larger product to add like a category, or just say this is the settings page or whatever. So I think having an additional label, tag, whatever can help. Some of the tricks that I've always done is once something's done, I just add a 9 to its priority. So if it was a 1 before, now it's a 91. So when I sort this by priority, it's now at the bottom, it's out of the way, and I still remember what its old priority was. And if you use a Google spreadsheet, you can actually look at the revision diff, and you can totally see when it was done and everything else. So you get your version history and all that stuff. Then I make little borders. So when I'm in like my final deployment, that's 6, 7, 8 priorities. Everything that's finished is after a 9, and then everything else goes here. And that's basically a sprint backlog. And then that can map to a much larger backlog if you've got 200 stories. But ultimately, for a sprint, you only need to be focused on the current sprint, and you can literally look at all that on a single screen in a single report. All right. Any questions about that?
Quick.
Yeah.
Does estimate mean number of weeks, or what are those numbers under the estimate column?
So we use story points, and there's a bunch of reasons for that. The main reason is that what you'll find in software development is that how people estimate something in terms of a number of days usually is wrong. So the idea is to use something called a point, and then somewhere in the middle of the project, usually by the 4th week, you can start to talk specifically about a point in terms of what's actually been burned down as opposed to what has been estimated to be burned down. So let's say you're expecting to do 5 days worth of work in 5 days, but it might turn out that you can only do 4 days of estimated work in 5 days, meaning that their estimates are basically 20% off. And you'll often find that is the case. That's called velocity. How many you burn down in a week, that's specific to a team, so you can't compare velocity of multiple teams. But velocity is a very important metric for managing uncertainty in a project, because once you know how your team estimates, then you can actually figure out, when am I going to deliver this thing? So the whole point of doing and what we call waterfall estimates is so then we can take all these estimates, roll them up into a number of days that are engineering days, and then count out the holidays and vacation to come up with, when am I going to actually get this thing done? When can I deliver this to my customer? So that's how that works. Any other questions? Yeah.
You linked to a couple of Rally software articles.
Mm-hmm.
You guys use that? Or?
We do not. We love their content. And we like some of their consultants, but we don't use their software right now. I've never actually personally used it, so I can't even say if it's good or bad.
Their YouTube videos are good.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Their stuff is great. Yes.
Do you have a list of kind of your favorite software tools, like from Bill.com to like Trello to like, is there a list of
I'd be glad to send our sales deck, which actually has our tooling. Basically, we use Pivotal Tracker for sprint planning. That's our favorite tool for project management. We like Unfuddle as an issue tracker. That's another cloud-based issue tracker. We use Google Docs for almost everything collaboratively focused. We use Toggle to track our time, which is a great sort of like cloud time tracking tool. On the development side, we use Git for our source code control. And I'm forgetting a few things, but that's one thing I'm totally forgetting on the engineering side that we use. But we use Beanstalk as our Git repo. They're like a local company that does Git repos, and they do a really good job. We actually use Free Conference Call for our conference calls, although we use the paid version, the one that doesn't say thank you for calling Free Conference Call. We use GoToMeeting for screen sharing. We do not use Conference Call screen sharing tool. We're not happy with GoToMeeting right now. They did some update at the beginning of the year, and their stuff has not worked the same. So we're looking for another screen sharing tool. But screen sharing is a big part of our selling process for our customers. So, in the old school days, if you had an enterprise software product, you literally jump into an airplane or whatever. So now, like, you can do a whole prototype demo over a GoToMeeting and sell from your living room or your bedroom. So it's a huge part of what we do. Any other questions? All right. So this is Keynote, that icon. So Keynote is a great UI UX prototyping tool. There's a set of templates called Keynotopia. Fairly inexpensive. Balsamiq, also inexpensive tool. Balsamiq has a 30-day free trial, so there's no reason why any of you can't use it. I'm going to talk more specifically about the prototyping. Axure is a professional prototyping tool. that you can do pixel perfect, literally do stuff that looks like full-blown products. It's expensive. I don't think the free trial. I would not recommend anyone in this room use Axure. It's way too much. But Keynote and Balsamic are good. There's also Envision app. There's Fluid. I listed a bunch of stuff in the assignment. It really doesn't matter what you guys use for a UI UX prototyping tool. This is Balsamic. So in Balsamic, it's meant to be like a PowerPoint almost for products. So if you can use PowerPoint to build a presentation, you can use Balsamic to build a mock-up for your prototype or for your product. So this is what Balsamic looks like for user interface. So we presented this to our customer. This is QTrack. We have another case study about QTrack on our website. It was originally called MMMP. We just didn't know what to call it. It was Mailroom Management, whatever. I don't even remember what it stands for. Yeah, exactly. And then there's like basically the finished product. So the idea of the prototype is that it doesn't look real. It doesn't look like it's pixel perfect. You can be transparent with your customer and say, what do you think of this? Give me feedback, etc. Creating this in Balsamic, there's videos online, and you could literally spend 15 minutes watching the videos online and you will know exactly how to create something in Balsamic. It's just that simple. They show an example of creating like an iTunes in Balsamic, and they do it in like 3 minutes. So it's a really nice tool. And so if you focus on doing a decomposition of, using some of the decomposition techniques that I mentioned in Balsamic, you should be able to basically rip through a few workflows pretty quickly. I'll show some other examples. This again in Balsamic, getting fancy with the colors, but these were created very quickly. So we'll often do sketches, so literally pen and paper, working with our customer to do initial concepting. So this is kind of the next phase. So concepting works great with one person sitting in a room. You can share it electronically, but eventually, you want something that's going to look a little bit more professional. Now this communicates very clearly to the customer. This is a prototype. We're in design. It's not done. But it also communicates a level of sincerity, like this is what we're building and this is what it's going to look like, and we've thought about all of these issues as we're doing it. So for this product, this is showing a search interface for packages, basically searching by a tracking number. It shows success. Then we jump into package details. You can see basically the envelope information of the package. And more of the same. So that is prototyping. Now, the benefit of prototyping. So prototyping, I'd say, didn't exist in its current form where you actually use tools. So people would often just code prototypes. So one of our designers can do one of these prototypes in minutes in some cases, whereas like an engineer to code one of these things might take days. So like it's all about efficiency and how much money you're going to spend. And if you're able to hire a team like us, it has every type of person, that's great because then it's like an hour here, an hour there. But for your own team, you don't want to spend too much, you don't want to spend too much on literally anything really. So you want to spend a minimal time on design. You have a question? So it depends on the tool. I would guide, or I would tell most people to just throw out your prototypes, and when the engineering team starts, just start coding day one. There's some people that believe that you should code your prototypes. I am of the personal opinion that in most cases that is a bad idea, but that's my personal opinion, and I could debate that with someone that feels otherwise. But there are people that believe that you should code your prototypes. I totally disagree with that. So I look at these as throwaway. just like an artist, designing for the trash can, it's kind of the same thing. These are meant to be quick, crank them out, get your customer approval, and then get down to the real deal. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I mean, I guess at the end of the day, they will film it simple by using this to kind of show what you want to do. It's not show what it will do.
Right. So there's no database attached to it, but you can still show a search interface. You can still show simulate what it would do if a database was attached. The idea being that hopefully you can show a whole experience. And Kenotopia, by the way, is pretty amazing. The person that won Startup Weekend a few years ago, Ted Mann, he's the CEO of SnipSnap. He did his entire Startup Weekend presentation in Kenotopia, and it literally looked like a mobile app. Like it had hotspots, he was clicking around, and it was literally a PDF that he created with Kenotopia that had hotspots, and it totally looked like an app. So he won Startup Weekend, and if you look at Startup Weekend, there's people going nuts coding all this stuff, and he's literally just using a design tool, and he won. Why? Because he had the best looking presentation, and also a really good idea, but by far his presentation was the best, and it's because he used a smart prototyping tool and knew how to use it. Kenotopia, you can get to more pixel perfect prototypes. Balsamic, by design, is meant to look very rugged, because there's a philosophy there that people believe you should always show something that doesn't look like a finished product in this phase, because it messes up people's expectations when they see something finished at this phase, because they think it should look exactly like that when it's finished, which it never does. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, you said there's no database attached or anything, so how does demonstrating the actual functionality of the prototype work?
Totally can demo. Okay. Completely can demo.
You define in the app this is step one, and then
yep.
When I click this button, render this. And
yeah, so you literally have a script. Okay. You literally have a script. Step one, I'm going to click in this box. Step two, I'm going to type university into that box, and then the tooltip will automatically show up as I type univ. The ursity comes up, and then I click that, and yeah, the whole thing. So, and if you do it and you practice it a couple times, and if you use something like Acture, it literally the whole thing looks totally real. It's amazing, and it exports to web. You can even get an app on your phone. It's pretty impressive. So we have some people here that know Acture. We're probably going to move away from it over time, just because we want to get to something that's just a bit more lean and agile. But Acture is a great tool. Yeah.
There's a difference, I think, between trying to make a pitch for Startup Weekend or trying to sell to a customer with a prototype, where you have that canned story, where you only have a few minutes, you want to get the buy-in for. We want to make it look like something like this, but if we were going to engage with an organization, a firm, to build out the product, it might make sense for founders, especially if you're a product owner, to go through that process more deeply. So you could go through it and fill in the gaps that you might not show in the context of a sale or a pitch.
Totally. So for the engineering team, the benefit of this is essentially more accurate estimates. So by going through, back in the old days, everything was done with Illustrator. Illustrator or Photoshop. You just got static screens, and none of the user interaction was really defined. None of the exception handling, none of the pop-ups. Some stuff would be loosely defined. It all depended upon the designer. What you get with interaction is you really get a better understanding of the business rules, and you can do more exception handling and literally find out that certain workflows and whatnot just totally don't work. And again, that's because you get your engineering team and whatnot involved and produce better estimates. So I would almost always advocate interactive prototyping. Even cases here, where I think some folks have advocated skipping that step, I'm almost always an advocate of it, because I just feel like it clearly communicates better than anything else the intent and rationale of the design, and that reduces the amount of uncertainty at every level of the organization. Particularly, again, my background being more in engineering, I've just been on so many teams that suck at estimating, and some of what they sucked at estimating was really they sucked at not seeing anything that wasn't right in front of their face. So, because they're just, I'd say generally speaking, not as creative. So, they look at these and they'd literally spec out everything in between, but they wouldn't spec out, that there's a suggest bar as I type university and then that drops down. Like that would be totally missed. So you really come up with better understanding of the business rules and then validation of those with the customer through the prototyping. So that's why I almost always advocate it. Yeah.
So you mentioned interactive prototyping. Do you consider wireframing to be interactive prototyping, or one step ahead of that, like using Kinetopia or such?
So I'm not sure exactly what you mean by wireframing. I would say anything where you're interactive. So like I'm clicking a button and something happens. So like there's like time is not, the element of time is not just switching screens. You know what I mean? There's like more to it.
So Bulk Summit, like what you are showing, is more of wireframing where it's not interactive, right?
You are absolutely correct. Yep. So I agree with you. There are there's ways that you can kind of simulate interactivity. It just requires a lot more work, like a lot more copy and paste. But generally speaking, you're right. So thank you for making that distinction too, because like what Acture can do is really amazing. One last thing, and I've just been working on this for a little while, and so I'm only going to show you a small sampling. But basically, there's product hacks that you can do to basically fake whatever it is you're trying to fake. But the goal is really to reduce scope of the project. Reducing scope is a win-win for everyone. It's a win-win for CEOs, the business team. It's a win-win for the engineering team. You're building less, therefore you're deploying faster, you're validating your business faster, etc. So the first product hack we've already talked about. Prototype it, i.e. don't build it. Build vaporware, sell the vaporware. Second product hack. Don't build it, measure it instead. So this is the O-Hours product, and we've done this on a bunch of our products. So founder will say to me, I need Twitter, I need LinkedIn, I need Facebook, I need Instagram, I need, they want to log in with like 50 different methods. And so what we say is, how about this? Take your best guess at one, we'll implement one, we'll measure the other three, and if you find out that 100,000 people click the Instagram thing on day one, we'll jump into Instagram. But every single one of those is a new vendor integration. And remember, in our specs, we talked about we need to point out all vendor integrations. Every vendor integration has overhead. You have to have a business deal, i.e. an API agreement. You have to integrate the vendor. You have to maintain it too. So we've had so many issues where someone updates their OAuth, like Google Apps updates their OAuth, and now our stuff's broken. So like, yeah, we spent $5,000 to build it, and now we need to spend $2,000 to fix it, a few months later. So all that stuff has maintenance costs. So build one, measure the rest, and then make an informed decision. Third thing, don't build it again. You're seeing a theme here. Don't build it. Fake it. So this is like a Mechanical Turk where you're basically simulating a machine, but there's actually a person clicking and moving all these knobs. And there's so much that you can do in sort of the fake it realm that people don't necessarily think about. Even just like automated emails that you would think need to be automated, you can literally manually just send the emails. People think, oh, I got to have it totally automated. No, actually, you don't. That is scope, and you're going to have to pay for it. So you really need to prioritize that when you absolutely need it. So if you don't need automated emails, then hire an admin, someone on one of these virtual assistants. We have a virtual assistant here. If I can make a recommendation, I'd be glad to. That literally part of their job description is to go through and send 5 manual emails a day. Maybe it's 10 or whatever. That is way cheaper than automating it and maintaining it in a lot of cases. So don't build it, fake it. Fourth product hack, use the default admin capabilities. So PHPMyAdmin, that's the only logo I could find, but actually Rails has an admin. Django, which is Python's, Python Django has an admin. So we've had products where we're building a SaaS solution for another company, and then they're selling their solution to other companies. So do we have to build a whole customer portal for our customer who knows like that they want to, that doesn't want to spend a fortune? No. Can you build a really minimal interface that doesn't look pretty, that lets them look at how many customers they have, look at how many orders they had yesterday? These are all basic interfaces into a database. And with Rails, with Python, there's literally very simple ways that you can very easily export all this functionality and they call it, it's like Rails admin, Python admin, and PHP MyAdmin is sort of a different category of those where it's direct to the database, but they're all kind of in the same vein. Don't build all these custom interfaces. Just use the admin capability. So if you as a founder should really consider just getting a read-only account to the database, have your engineer create it, and then just start pounding away in PHP MyAdmin. You don't need a custom report. Which gives me to my next product hack. Less product, emphasis on reports. So you'd be amazed how many people ask us to generate automated reports that are available daily in a drive or emailed or whatever, or they want it in an interface. And reporting is actually really, really expensive. Some of the reports that people want to generate require, really, really complex database architectures to support the queries that will give you the reports on demand, especially if you have large data sets. Like usually reports have to get queued, processed, and then they're delivered, and then they're available to a customer. So I would argue you should put way less emphasis on doing reports in real time or whatever, and literally just do CSV dumps for Excel in as many cases as you can get away with, and try to convince your customers to find these reports totally acceptable, even if their competitors have these beautiful online reports. Some of it, if it's not part of the core value proposition, who cares? It's just a checkbox that they need to have this because their current product has this, so you need to have it, but it doesn't need to look pretty. So I would just say put heavy emphasis on manual reporting and doing less product. And part of that just ends up being like being a really good scope assassin, identifying opportunities to reduce scope from your products, and pushing forward with not building them. So anyway, that's really it for the talk. I want to talk about the assignment. All right. The assignment is easy. All right. So the assignment, sorry for that being so far over there. But basically, the goal is to create a mock-up using one of these prototyping tools for basically identifying two workflows in your system. So two workflows could be the admin portal where they need to add a user, and then you add a user, and then you give them some privilege, and then once they have that privilege, you send them an email. Some series of workflows that someone does, like a multi-step workflow. Pick two of those, model those out in one of these prototyping tools. So it can be Balsamiq, it could be Keynote, Keynotopia, whatever. The next, create a spreadsheet with an exhaustive list of user stories for that workflow. And so remember, the user stories have subject, verb, object. So take the roles in that system of that workflow and write out the user stories. And the first user story that you write will take you a really long time. And I don't know why this is, because you think it's a tuple, it's subject, verb, object, it should be really simple. It takes a while. And then hopefully your second user story happens faster, but for whatever reason, getting started with user stories it doesn't happen instantly. You just need to sort of think through them and run through them. And I have examples in my presentation, so you can take a few from there. Next, estimate each individual story in terms of level of difficulty. So I understand many of you don't have engineers that could actually estimate these. So if you have an engineer, I would say ask them to estimate it. If you don't, then I think you just need to take a swag at it on your own. I think it's more important that you have a backlog that has estimates than to just say, I don't have estimates and I can't continue. So try to create an exhaustive list of user stories as detailed as you can, and then estimate each one of those individually. And so the estimate has to be in terms of 1, 2, 4, or 8 points, and you assume that 2 points is 1 engineering day for a developer. Which brings us to the next thing, which is to compute the total number of engineering days for that workflow. So once you do that, you'll have basically a set of the scope. Now, going to the iron triangle, you need to figure out the budget and the timeline. So for this project, we'll assume that your engineering team, which hopefully you don't pay them what a consulting rate would be, but let's just say you pay them $125 an hour, $1,000 a day, which would mean that each point is worth $500. So that's how you're going to calculate your budget. Take your total number of points and multiply each one by 500. That's your budget. And that's essentially, if your estimates were accurate, what you could expect in terms of a market rate. Next is timeline. Compute a calendar date based on your waterfall estimate, subtracting holidays, vacation, and everything else. If you don't have any engineers on your team, assume you have one. If you have more than one, then assume you have two. But what this will do is, let's just say your total scope has 100 engineering days. Then mapping that to the date that you're actually going to ship is an exercise. It's like you got to look at the calendar. You got to be like, oh, well, here's the holidays. Joe and Sally are going to take vacation. Whatever. It's not easy. But this is what a project manager does when they actually have to figure out timeline. Now, a lot of this stuff is what you can do as a project manager. Now, if you were a designer, the specification of scope from a design perspective kind of informs this more written form of it. If we were designers, then we build out, basically the mock-ups and then the written form can easily get out of sync with one another. So the goal is to kind of synchronize these kind of frequently as we're doing our discovery process. But you're more in the mode doing this exercise as a project manager, not the art person, or I should say the creative person. All right, and then the presentation format. So the first slide, you'll describe the workflow, you'll show the budget, you'll show the delivery date. Second, you'll show a screenshot of your spreadsheet summary. So literally just take the spreadsheet that you have, screenshot it, stick it in a slide. Third is show the representative mock-ups and then repeat it for the workflows. And that's it. So we'll critique those. It'll be back here, and I'll be here so I can walk through and hopefully make you guys better project managers. Any questions?
Very cool.
Thank you. Thank you.
Welcome.